Nick asked me to come and describe some description of the Wavi work, and we've got 6 categories here. Wavi does an auditory P300, which is a method of measuring an event-related potential, ERP. Some people have asked, what's the difference between EEG and ERP? EEGs measure the brain at rest, just sitting idling, and ERPs measure the brain in response to some kind of stimulus. So in this case, the auditory stimulus is a sound where you hear a couple of beeps in a row, random beeps in a row that are the same low pitch. And then there's this oddball, they call it, an oddball beep that's a higher pitch that is randomly inserted among those other beeps. And when you hear that, your brain registers an extra wave. And that's called the P300 because it's supposed to happen at about 300 milliseconds. So that's what this test is. It's a very good measure of concussion and TBI and all kinds of different problems, from PTSD to mental decline. Physical reaction time is another thing that's being measured, and physical reaction time is simply how long it takes for you to respond to a computer after a stimulus, and that's a significant factor for concussions and head injuries. Trail making is a process where the person is playing a computer game where they have to take their finger and touch different numbers or different letters in order, and they have to hunt for and find those on a screen. So it checks their peripheral vision, their reaction time, their awareness, their ability to concentrate. It kind of screens for people that might get tunnel vision, like people with PTSD or stress factors. So trail making, we do 2 of them, trail making A and trail making B. And those are different measures that, one is a little shorter and one's a little longer. And so they measure your endurance and your capacity for sustaining a task that's kind of a hard cognitive task. The next one is the theta-beta ratio at CZ. So CZ is on the top of your head, and the theta-beta ratio has to do with the ratio of low frequencies, which are theta, to high frequencies, which are beta. So low frequency theta waves are the waves of healing and the waves of meditation, the wave of relaxation, and the brain wave that we have when we're falling asleep and switching gears in our brain from awake to asleep. So theta waves are very low key and very relaxed. Beta waves are the adult thinking brain waves that have to do with when you're awake and aware, if you're doing something that has consequences, something a kid can't do, a little child can't do, something like balancing a checkbook or driving a car or slicing meat. These kinds of things that have consequences that have to be done one thing at a time sequentially. A, B, C, D, and you can't do D before A. So any kind of thing like that is a very beta wave. So a theta-beta ratio means the person's theta waves relative to beta is a certain number. So if you have a lot of theta or a high theta to beta ratio, you have a lot of these spacey theta waves and very little of the beta waves relatively. So that person is not very with it. That person is not really present intellectually, emotionally. They're not present in the room. They're not really accurately perceiving what's going on. So a high theta-beta ratio is not so good. On the other hand, you don't want to have an abnormally low one either, because if you had abnormally low theta and very high beta, that might be the profile of a patient with ADHD, for example, because ADHD is characterized by people with high beta waves, overly high beta waves, and not enough theta waves. So they don't have enough chill, and they have a lot of real anxiety states. You see this in high anxiety states of patients, and you see it in people with ADHD because their brain is just buzzing and going from thing to thing to thing. So we don't want too low, we get the spacey person. We don't want too high, we get the person who's just hypervigilant. The 5th one, next to last, is the F3, F4 alpha power. The F3, F4 alpha power is a description of the frontal 3 and the frontal 4 power levels, which has to do with how much alpha waves are coming out of the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. Now, the left hemisphere is often involved in depression and balancing motivation, and the right hemisphere is involved in anxiety. So these are the approach avoidance hemispheres. The left hemisphere is the approach hemisphere. It guides and modulates approach activities and functions, and the right hemisphere and frontal lobe modulates avoidance activities, things that have to do with not avoiding something that might be dangerous or might be repellent to a person or even an animal. Animals exhibit these behaviors. So the ratio of F3 to F4 should be roughly equal. There's a little bit of a difference. It doesn't have to be exactly equal, but if it was heavily weighted more left side, that might give us a lot more left output and a lot less right, and that would set us up for an imbalance of the brain. Likewise, if it was low F3 and high F4 output, that'd be high output in the right hemisphere and the right frontal lobe, and that would also be an out of balance thing. So we want balance here. We don't want exact numbers. We want a range of numbers that are statistically normal. But F3, F4 has to do with how balanced is the right versus the left frontal lobes in their alpha waves. Connectivity is the last one, and connectivity is probably the one that I spend the most time talking with clinicians about, because this one is very clinician specific. This is very dependent on interpretation, and it's not easy to explain to a layperson. However, connectivity is it's also called coherence, and it has to do with how connected are different brain areas to other brain areas. And you can think about connectivity as if you had a bunch of soldiers working and marching together. If they were marching together and they were in complete connectivity, they would be marching in step and they would do everything the same. Now that might not be so good in battle, but it'd be great if they were marching. But if they were in battle, it would not be so good because they couldn't have independent action. So you don't want your brain to be too connected. You don't want there to be too much connection between areas, but you also don't want them to be too disconnected. So there's this sweet spot, again, as there is with everything. There's a sweet spot of how much connectivity do we want and how little do we want. We don't want too much and we don't want too little. That's kind of the Goldilocks idea of not too hot, not too cold. That's the overview of what does Wavi mean in 6 easy pieces.
Perfect.
This is a Wavi report, and it's a sample of what you can expect when you get a baseline scan or when you get an after-action scan when you've had an incident and you want to have your brain scanned. What you'll see in this report is sometimes the original baseline if you're only getting a baseline, and in some cases you'll get multiple graphs that compare multiple readings because the computer can remember that and can compare your initial reading versus your follow-up readings. And so I think, Nick, you might have one in your stack there. Yeah, this one. So this shows an example of multiple readings showing the initial baseline patient is okay, then lowered activity because they've had a concussion, and then return to play because their brain's back to normal. So it's a pictorial representation that shows the patient healed and is doing better after having had a problem. You'll also see on the report that there are the different ratios that we talked about a little earlier. If you saw the earlier section, there are ratios that are described, and those ratios are up here in this area that describe those ratios of different parts of the brain and different brain waves. We have some reaction times and speeds and voltages here, and then we also have the color map of the P300, and we have the coherence map of all the different sites of data collection and how they're linked together, and if they're overconnected or underconnected. Underconnected is on the blue side. You can see this person doesn't have much underconnectivity, but they have a fair amount of overconnectivity because they've got the bright warm colors that are on the red spectrum, not so much the blue spectrum. While we're at it, let's take a minute and go back to the P300 values, which we haven't explained yet. The P300 values, we talked about where they are on the brain and how they're generated through sounds with that oddball sound, but we didn't talk about what they are. And so up here we talk about the P300 delay and the P300 voltage. Now the P300 delay has to do with how long does it take you to finally react in your brain to hearing and recognizing that you've heard an oddball sound. That is very telling for us to figure out what's going on with your brain, if it's very healthy or if it's had some slowing in reaction to both cognitive types of scenarios and physical types of scenarios. So whether you're in sports and you want to have good reaction time, not just simple reaction time like a reaction where you flash a light and have a reaction, but reaction time is a little more complex, where you're discerning a relevant reaction, or a relevant stimulus from something around you that might be noise. And the P300 is perfect for that because the P300 measures those regular noises of beep, 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 and then the oddball beep, the higher sound. And that's pretty much what it sounds like when you're listening to it. So you'll be able to measure that and see if there's a delay in the processing time of that signal. The next part is the voltage. The P300 also has a voltage. There's a certain amount of voltage that should be firing through your brain in different regions of your brain, but mostly centered around the top of your head. And those areas, those voltages should reach a certain level. They shouldn't be too high and they shouldn't be too low. And then a lot of people with a brain injury, they end up being too low. And those patients don't do very well because they just don't generate the voltage that they should generate when they hear that oddball sound. Now, on a side note, many of your doctors and physicians may have worked with P300s before, and there is an auditory P300, which is the most common. That's the one that you listen to those oddball sounds. But there's also visual P300s too, for those of you that may have heard of that, or for patients that are deaf.